All right, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm honored to have gotten this award and really excited to share a bit about my program of research and also where I hope to take this work into the future. All right, so in January of last year, Twitter erupted with debate when Kyle Plant Emoji posted this viral article. Kyle was a verbal thinker. All his life, he could hear his voice in his head, speaking in full sentences as if he was talking out loud. And one day he stumbled across a classmate who didn't have this internal monologue. They were shocked. Neither had any idea that some people think only in the form of verbal mental sentences. Others experience only mental images or pictures or movies that play in mind. And still others of us have both verbal thoughts and mental images. Just like Kyle and his classmate, if I were to ask a bunch of you here in the audience today how you typically experience your cognitions, some would report verbal thoughts, some only mental imagery, and a majority of us would report both mental imagery and verbal thoughts. There likely are people listening to this talk right now who are mentally imagining some of the fantastic presentations you've seen so far, what they're having for dinner later this evening, or perhaps what everyone's houses look like beyond their Zoom screens. It makes sense then that many people also experience mental imagery when feeling distressed. We may have worked with clients who experience flashbacks associated with PTSD, images of feared stimuli relevant to phobias, or mental images of aversive social outcomes in social phobia. But in clinical settings, we typically ask our clients about their experience of verbal thoughts. And many of our cognitive interventions focus solely on addressing verbal cognitions. Therefore, my program of research aims to clarify the role mental imagery plays in the etiology and maintenance of mood symptoms, and to develop and test novel mental imagery-based interventions that more effectively treat mood disorders. So where did I start with this work? My very first ever therapy client really struggled with rumination. She dwelled on negative experiences over and over again and couldn't seem to disengage from this perseveration. So of course, as a dutiful first-time clinician, I went back to the literature and found tons of evidence that rumination is really highly associated with depressive symptom severity. But as I read more and more about rumination, I found that nearly everyone conceptualized rumination as a verbal thought process. So dwelling on these negative cognitions in the form of verbal mental sentences. And that was different from the rumination my client was reporting to me. She told me instead that she got stuck replaying this negative movie on repeat in her mind. She ruminated in the form of mental imagery. So I designed a series of studies that examined whether rumination may be even more highly associated with depressive symptom severity when individuals tend to ruminate in the form of mental imagery compared to verbal thought. In the first of these studies, I asked adults to report how much they tend to ruminate, the severity of their depressive symptoms, and whether they tend to ruminate in the form of verbal thoughts, mental images, or both verbal thoughts and mental images. And here you see that rumination was even more highly associated with depressive symptom severity for adults who ruminated in the form of mental imagery, or both mental imagery and verbal thought compared to verbal thought alone. I then replicated these findings in adolescents, again finding that imagery-based rumination was associated with significantly more severe depressive symptoms than rumination in verbal form. And what do we find when we look at those adolescents with elevated rumination? This effect was even stronger. So ruminating in the form of mental imagery is associated with higher depressive symptom severity than verbal rumination that we typically study and ask about, especially when individuals tend to ruminate in response to negative experiences. So while I started my work on mental imagery by looking at mental imagery in the context of rumination, I knew that other cognitive processes likely also commonly take the form of mental imagery and maybe even more maladaptive than verbal forms of these exact same cognitions. So now about this time in my training, I moved on to internship and started working with youth experiencing more severe psychopathology on partial and inpatient units. And not surprisingly, a common component of my work with these youth was assessing for suicide risk, or asking whether they had or were currently having thoughts of suicide. But fairly often, I would encounter a teen who responded, "No," with clear hesitation. So I started asking about suicidal mental imagery, or mental pictures or movies that play in mind of suicide-related content. And quite often, youth confirmed that they had mentally imagined suicide, even if they had previously denied suicidal verbal thoughts. So this led me to wonder if we're missing an important subsample of individuals in our current assessments of suicide risk, and whether experiencing suicidal mental imagery may put individuals at increased risk for suicidal behavior relative to the suicidal verbal thoughts we typically study and ask about. So the first thing I did was ask a sample of college students who had reported suicidal cognitions to report whether they had experienced suicidal verbal thoughts and whether they had experienced suicidal mental imagery. And here we see that not only was suicidal mental imagery associated with more intense and longer duration of suicidal cognitions, it was associated with nearly 3 times higher odds of having made a suicide attempt, even after accounting for suicidal verbal thoughts. I then replicated this finding in adolescents experiencing psychiatric hospitalization, again finding suicidal mental imagery to be associated with significantly higher odds of suicide attempt. So at this point, we're accumulating evidence that it may be important to ask individuals whether they ruminate in the form of mental imagery and whether they've ever imagined suicide. But how do we go about actually intervening? This brings me to the second aim of my research, to develop and test interventions that incorporate mental imagery to hopefully more effectively reduce distress. First, I wanted to know whether mental imagery could distract individuals from these negative experiences more effectively than verbal thought, hopefully preventing rumination. So here I brought adolescents into the lab, induced negative mood using a social rejection paradigm, and then randomly assigned adolescents to distract themselves from this negative experience in either the form of mental imagery or verbal thought using standardized prompts. So here is an example where they were prompted to think about or imagine different reasons why they might miss class. Adolescents who distracted themselves using mental imagery experienced greater affective improvement, as well as a more adaptive physiological response. So higher high-frequency heart rate variability, which is a marker of emotion regulation, and lower skin conductance response, which is a marker of emotional arousal. And I've since replicated this in a sample of depressed adults, where instead of inducing them to distract themselves in the form of mental imagery or verbal thought, I had them distract themselves in whatever form they typically do, and then ask them afterwards, how much mental imagery or verbal thought do you experience? And again, found that the more mental imagery individuals naturally use to distract themselves, the more their affect improved. So mental imagery seems to be better than verbal thoughts at providing distraction following these negative experiences. But we also know that distraction is a fairly short-term strategy, and we don't always want to distract ourselves from our emotions or experiences. So as a next step, I'm currently testing 2 imagery-based intervention techniques that could be even more effective. So in the first of these studies, I'm inducing positive mental imagery about the future in a sample of adolescents experiencing psychiatric hospitalization due to suicide risk. For example, here, making and keeping strong friendships. The hope here is that by imagining a positive future or reasons for living, we could induce a more adaptive affective and physiological response in the short term and hopefully help to prevent suicidal behavior in the longer term. In the second study, I'm working towards applying these imagery-based strategies outside the lab, hoping to reach teens who need these skills in daily life. So in this EMA study, adolescents complete smartphone surveys in which they indicate when they're stuck in these cycles of repetitive negative cognitions. They then receive an ecological momentary intervention in which they're prompted to complete a mindfulness exercise each time they report being stuck in these cycles of negative cognitions. So after each mindfulness exercise, they report how much mental imagery or verbal thought they experienced during mindfulness. And here I'm particularly interested in whether greater mental imagery during mindfulness could enhance intervention outcomes. So where do I see this taking me into the future? I plan to continue to evaluate and disseminate imagery-based interventions. This could be in the form of standalone interventions, such as imagery rescripting, or using mental imagery to augment existing interventions, for example, to bolster motivation to engage in behavioral activation, or to increase the likelihood of safety plan use. But not all individuals in need of these interventions are showing up in our clinics or offices. So I'm also committed to continuing to get these imagery-based assessments and interventions into the hands of adolescents in the very moments and settings in which they need them. Thank you again to JCCAP for the award, all of you for your interest, and of course, all the mentors and colleagues who have helped make it to this point.